My name is Adelina Marsh, and I am 32 years old. For 6 years, my family-in-law has believed I once worked as a hotel housekeeper before marrying their son, a story I never corrected because correcting it would have required explaining a decade of my life I had deliberately chosen to leave behind me. What they did not know, what I never once volunteered because nobody in that family ever cared enough to ask a real question, is that before I met my husband, I spent 9 years working inside the diplomatic service, first as a junior attaché, then as a cultural liaison, and finally as the personal protocol advisor to Ambassador Julian Castellane, one of the most respected diplomatic figures in the region. I did not lie about my past. I simply let a single careless assumption calcify into an accepted family fact, because by the time I understood how deeply that assumption had taken root, correcting it felt like more trouble than it was worth. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by people who never once bothered to ask who you actually were. I grew up the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to put food on our table, and I am not ashamed of that history, not even slightly. I mention it because it explains, I think, why the assumption my husband's family made about me took hold so easily and so completely. When I met Callum Marsh at a diplomatic reception 6 years ago, an event I attended in my professional capacity as protocol advisor, my mother happened to be working a cleaning shift at the same downtown building where the reception was held, in a different wing entirely, hours before the event began. Callum's father, Reginald Marsh, a wealthy commercial real estate developer with a habit of collecting small, cutting details about people and repeating them as though they constituted a full understanding, somehow learned that my mother cleaned office buildings for a living, and from that single fact, he constructed an entire narrative about who I must be. I remember, with painful clarity, the first family dinner at the Marsh estate, 6 months into my relationship with Callum, when Reginald asked me, in front of the entire extended family, what kind of work I did before meeting his son. I told him, honestly, that I had worked in diplomatic protocol, coordinating official visits and cultural exchanges for the regional consulate. Reginald laughed, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular condescension of a man who had already decided what he believed and had no intention of updating it based on something as inconvenient as a direct answer. Protocol, cleaning, organizing schedules, I suppose it's all a kind of housekeeping in the end, isn't it? He said, and the table laughed along with him, and Callum, 26 years old at the time and still deeply eager for his father's approval, laughed too, softly, apologetically, in a way that told me exactly how this family operated and exactly how little room there would be, going forward, for me to occupy any space that Reginald had not already assigned me. I want to explain why I did not correct him more forcefully in that moment, and why I continued not correcting him for 6 subsequent years, because I think the reasoning matters for understanding everything that eventually happened at the gala where this story reaches its turning point. I was, at that first dinner, still relatively early in a relationship with a man I genuinely loved, uncertain whether that relationship would survive contact with a family this wealthy and this insular, and I made a calculation, rightly or wrongly, that correcting Reginald's mistaken impression too forcefully in that first meeting would cost me more socially than simply letting the misunderstanding stand and hoping it would naturally correct itself over time as the family got to know me better. It did not correct itself. Instead, over 6 years, the story hardened into an accepted family fact, repeated at gatherings, referenced in casual conversation, eventually becoming so deeply embedded in the family's understanding of who I was that on the rare occasions I mentioned some detail from my former career, a diplomatic reception I had once organized, a foreign dignitary I had once briefed on regional customs, the family would simply nod politely and change the subject, as though I were embellishing a modest past, out of some understandable but faintly embarrassing need to seem more interesting than I actually was. I stopped correcting them eventually, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of realizing that some people have decided who you are so completely that presenting them with contrary evidence only makes them more certain of their original assessment, treating your correction as further proof of the insecurity they already assumed you carried. I want to describe in more detail than I have so far exactly what those 9 years in the diplomatic service actually involved, because I think the scope of what I gave up, quietly and without fanfare, matters for understanding exactly how much the Marsh family's careless assumption actually cost me over 6 years. I joined the Foreign Ministry's Junior Attaché program at 23, immediately after completing a graduate degree in international relations that I paid for entirely through scholarships and part-time work, since my mother's modest income from cleaning office buildings could never have covered tuition at the university I attended. I spent my first 2 years in the program rotating through various regional postings, learning the granular, exacting work of diplomatic protocol, the precise seating arrangements that could either smooth or inadvertently insult a visiting delegation, the specific gift customs that varied significantly between different cultures and needed to be understood in exhaustive detail before any official visit could proceed without incident. By 26, I had been promoted to cultural liaison, a role that placed me at the center of coordinating increasingly significant diplomatic visits, briefing senior officials on cultural sensitivities before international summits, managing the countless small details that most people never think about when they watch two heads of state shake hands on television, but which, if mishandled, can genuinely derail years of careful diplomatic relationship building. I remember, vividly, coordinating a state visit in my 27th year that nearly collapsed over a seating arrangement dispute I resolved personally, staying awake for nearly 40 hours straight negotiating between two delegations whose cultural expectations about hierarchical seating conflicted in ways that threatened to embarrass both governments publicly if not handled with exceptional delicacy. By 29, I had been appointed personal protocol advisor to Ambassador Julienne Castellane, one of the most demanding and most respected figures in our diplomatic corps, a woman known throughout the ministry for having exceptionally high standards and very little patience for advisors who could not anticipate problems before they became crises. Working directly under her for nearly 4 years taught me more about the granular mechanics of international diplomacy than any graduate program ever could have, and I take genuine, quiet pride in the work I did during those years, coordinating 3 separate state visits, managing cultural protocol for 2 major international summits, and personally briefing dozens of officials on customs and sensitivities that, had they been mishandled, could have created genuine diplomatic incidents. I met Callum during my 31st year at a diplomatic reception I had personally organized to welcome a visiting trade delegation, an event where Callum had been invited as the son of a prominent local business figure whose company was exploring potential partnerships with several members of the delegation. I remember our first conversation clearly, standing near the edge of that reception discussing, of all things, the particular architectural history of the building we stood in, a subject Callum knew considerably more about than most of the diplomats in attendance, given his own background in commercial real estate development. I was drawn to him precisely because he seemed, in that first conversation, genuinely curious about my work rather than dismissive of it, asking thoughtful questions about the protocol challenges involved in coordinating an event of that scale. I resigned from my position roughly a year after we married, a decision I made for complicated reasons that I have not always been fully honest with myself about, even now. Part of the decision was genuinely personal, a desire to build a quieter family life after nearly a decade of demanding, all-consuming diplomatic work that regularly required me to travel for weeks at a time with almost no advance notice. Part of the decision, I have come to understand more clearly in the years since the gala, was also shaped by a subtler pressure from the Marsh family itself, a family whose wealth and social standing meant that Callum had never needed to build his own life around demanding professional work in the way I had, and whose comfortable assumption seemed to be that a wife's career, however demanding, would naturally take a secondary position to the family's broader social and business priorities. I do not regret marrying Callum, even now, even knowing everything that eventually happened. But I have had to reckon honestly, in the years since the gala, with how much of my own professional identity I allowed to quietly recede once I joined a family that had never fully understood or valued what that identity actually represented. My mother, I should mention, met Callum's family exactly twice in the 6 years before the gala, both times at relatively minor gatherings where Reginald's condescension toward her was, if anything, even more pronounced than his condescension toward me. He treated her, on both occasions, with a kind of performative graciousness that barely concealed his underlying assumption that she occupied a fundamentally different social tier than the rest of the family, offering her the kind of exaggerated politeness people sometimes extend to service staff rather than to a guest at a family gathering. My mother, a proud, dignified woman who had spent 30 years supporting our small family through demanding physical labor, never once complained about this treatment directly to me, though I noticed, After each of those two gatherings, a particular quiet withdrawal in her that told me exactly how acutely she had felt the condescension, regardless of how carefully she tried to hide it from me. I think about my mother often in the context of this story, because I believe her presence, quiet and dignified throughout those two uncomfortable gatherings, taught me something important about the particular dignity required to withstand consistent underestimation without allowing it to define you. She never once apologized for her work, never once diminished herself in an attempt to seem more acceptable to a family that had already decided she occupied a lesser tier of existence. She simply continued, quietly and consistently, being exactly who she was, regardless of how the Marsh family chose to perceive her. I think I absorbed some version of that same quiet resilience during those 6 years, though I will admit, honestly, that my own resilience occasionally shaded into something closer to exhausted resignation rather than my mother's more genuine, unshakable self-possession. Callum, to his credit, knew the truth. I had told him everything within our first few months together, and he had, at least in private, always understood and respected my career history. But Callum's relationship with his father operated on a foundation of conflict avoidance so deeply entrenched that he had simply never found, in 6 years, the will to correct his father's mistaken narrative about me in front of the rest of the family, preferring instead to let the misunderstanding stand rather than risk the difficult confrontation that correcting it publicly would require. I understood this about my husband, and for most of our marriage, I forgave it because I understood exactly how difficult Reginald could be to confront directly, having experienced that difficulty myself at every family gathering for 6 consecutive years. 6 years into our marriage, Reginald Marsh was approaching a milestone that mattered enormously to him, both personally and professionally. His commercial real estate development firm, Marsh Properties, had spent the past 3 years working to secure the largest contract in the company's history, a partnership with a foreign government delegation to develop a significant mixed-use commercial district as part of a broader diplomatic and trade initiative between our country and theirs. The contract, once finalized, would be worth well over $400 million, and Reginald had planned an elaborate gala celebration to mark its signing, an event he intended to use not simply as a business celebration, but as a public demonstration of the Marsh family's arrival at the very highest levels of civic and diplomatic importance. The gala, scheduled for a Saturday evening in late September, would be attended by nearly 300 guests, including several members of the foreign delegation whose government the contract involved, local business leaders, city officials, and, most significantly for reasons that would only become clear later that evening, several members of the diplomatic corps, including, I would eventually learn, Ambassador Julienne Castellane herself, the very woman I had once served as personal protocol advisor before leaving that career, behind to build a quieter life with Callum. I had not spoken with Ambassador Castellane in nearly 5 years, not since I had formally resigned my position to focus on my marriage and, at the time, our early attempts to start a family, a period of our lives that had proven more difficult and more private than I ever discussed with the Marsh family. I did not know, in the weeks leading up to the gala, that the ambassador would be attending, and I certainly did not know that her presence at that gala would become the single event that finally unraveled 6 years of careful, patient underestimation. I want to tell you honestly what the 6 years leading up to that gala actually felt like from the inside, because I think the texture of that slow erosion matters as much as the dramatic reveal that eventually followed it. Being consistently underestimated by people who claim to love you does not feel, in any single moment, like an unbearable crisis. It feels, instead, like 1,000 small cuts, each one individually survivable, each one easy to dismiss as an isolated incident rather than a pattern, until eventually the accumulated weight of those small cuts becomes something you carry every single day without quite realizing how heavy it has become. Reginald's condescension toward me took many forms over those 6 years, rarely cruel in any single instance, but relentlessly, exhaustingly consistent. He addressed me at every family gathering with a particular gentle, patronizing tone, the tone adults sometimes use with children or with people they believe simply cannot follow more complex conversation. When the family discussed business matters, international trade policy, or diplomatic affairs, subjects I understood, in fact, considerably better than most of the people in that room given my 9 years of direct professional experience, Reginald would routinely stop mid-conversation to explain basic concepts to me in simplified terms, assuming, always, That my background and what he understood to be housekeeping left me without the capacity to follow even moderately sophisticated discussion. I remember one particular dinner, roughly 3 years into my marriage, when the extended family discussed a diplomatic incident that had made regional news, a minor scandal involving a foreign delegation's visit gone wrong due to a protocol error during an official reception. I had, in fact, personally advised on the protocol standards for exactly that category of diplomatic visit during my career, and I understood precisely what had likely gone wrong in the incident being discussed, information I could have contributed meaningfully to the conversation. Reginald, noticing me following the discussion attentively, turned to me with exaggerated patience and said, "Don't worry, Adelina, I know all these diplomatic terms probably sound like another language to you. It's all right, you don't need to understand all of it." The table laughed softly, and I said nothing, because 6 years of careful cuts had already taught me that correcting Reginald in front of an audience simply produced a more elaborate, more condescending explanation of why my correction did not actually change his underlying assessment of me. Callum's mother, Vivian Marsh, was somewhat gentler in her condescension, though no less consistent in its underlying assumption. She routinely introduced me to family friends and business associates with a particular, softly apologetic phrasing, something along the lines of, "This is Callum's wife, Adelina. She comes from a very humble background. We're all so proud of how well she's adapted to our world," a sentence that managed, in a single breath, to reduce 9 years of demanding professional achievement to nothing more than successful assimilation into a wealthier family's lifestyle. I heard some version of that same introduction at nearly every social event I attended with the Marsh family over 6 years, and each time, I felt the same small, familiar cut, the particular pain of being defined entirely by an inaccurate story that had somehow become more real in the minds of the people telling it than the actual truth of who I was. Callum's younger sister, Priscilla, engaged in a subtler but equally corrosive form of the same underestimation, treating me with the kind of performative, condescending kindness people sometimes extend to someone they view as fundamentally beneath them but wish to appear generous toward regardless. She routinely offered me her older clothing, "In case it's useful for you," gave me unsolicited advice about proper etiquette at formal events, since I know this world can feel overwhelming if you didn't grow up in it, and once memorably, at a family Christmas gathering, suggested that I might enjoy a job at the family's real estate office answering phones, something manageable. That wouldn't be too demanding given everything you're used to. I want to be honest that I considered, on several occasions throughout those 6 years, simply correcting the record decisively and permanently, sitting the entire family down and explaining in full exactly what my career had actually involved. I did not do this, and looking back, I think the reasons were complicated and not entirely flattering to admit. Part of me, I believe, had grown genuinely curious, in a way that felt almost like an anthropological experiment, to see exactly how long this family could sustain such a thoroughly inaccurate narrative about a person they claimed to love, how much evidence to the contrary they would need before their assumption finally cracked under its own weight. Part of me, more painfully, had also begun to wonder whether correcting the record would even matter, whether a family this committed to a particular story about who I was would simply reframe any correction as further proof of the insecurity or exaggeration they already assumed defined me. Callum, throughout these 6 years, occupied an uncomfortable middle position, aware of the truth, privately affectionate and respectful toward my actual history, but consistently unwilling to correct his father in the moments when correction mattered most. I confronted him about this pattern more than once during our marriage, and each time, he offered some version of the same explanation, that his father was simply set in his ways, that confronting Reginald directly rarely produced the intended result and often simply escalated into a longer, more painful conflict, that it was easier, ultimately, to let these small comments pass rather than turn every family gathering into a battleground over a misunderstanding that, in Callum's mind, did not fundamentally change how he himself felt about me. I want to be fair to Callum in this story, because I think it would be easy to simply cast him as a villain alongside his father, and I do not believe that characterization would be accurate or fair to the complexity of our actual marriage. Callum loved me genuinely in the ways that mattered most in our private life together, and our marriage, apart from this one specific, persistent wound, was in most respects a happy and stable one. But I want to be equally honest that his repeated unwillingness to correct his family's misunderstanding of me, sustained across 6 years despite my occasional requests that he do so, constituted its own quieter betrayal, a passive complicity in a story that diminished me every time it was repeated, even if Callum himself never actively believed that diminished version of who I was. I want to describe one more incident from those 6 years before moving forward with the story of the gala itself, because I think it captures something particularly important about how thoroughly the Marsh family's assumption had settled into their understanding of me by the time the gala finally arrived. Roughly a year before the gala, the Marsh family hosted a smaller dinner party for several of Reginald's business associates, including a mid-level trade official from a neighboring region whose government maintained ongoing commercial relationships with Marsh properties. During dinner, this official mentioned in passing a diplomatic protocol dispute his own government had recently navigated involving a state visit gone slightly awry, and I found myself, almost involuntarily, offering a brief, informed observation about how such disputes were typically resolved through informal back-channel negotiations before they escalated into anything requiring public acknowledgement. The trade official looked at me with sudden, genuine interest, asking how I happened to know so much about diplomatic protocol resolution mechanisms. Before I could answer, Reginald interjected smoothly, "Adelina has always had a knack for picking up interesting little facts, don't you, dear? Probably from watching the news. She's quite good at retaining trivia like that." The trade official laughed politely, clearly uncertain what to make of the comment, and the conversation moved on without me correcting the record. Because by that point, a year before the gala, I had grown so exhausted by the pattern of correction and dismissal that I simply let the moment pass, the way I had let so many similar moments pass across 6 years. I mention this specific incident because I think it illustrates something important about how the pattern operated. It was never simply that Reginald actively, maliciously insisted I had been a cleaner in every single conversation. It was subtler and, in some ways, more corrosive than that, a consistent, almost reflexive tendency to reframe any evidence of my genuine expertise as incidental trivia, coincidental knowledge, anything other than what it actually represented, which was nearly a decade of demanding, hard-won professional expertise that Reginald had simply decided, years earlier, could not possibly belong to someone from my family background. By the time the gala finally arrived, I had absorbed hundreds of these small moments, each one individually forgettable, collectively devastating in their cumulative weight. I want to be honest that in the weeks leading up to the gala, I felt a particular low-grade dread about attending yet another Marsh family event where I would inevitably occupy the same comfortable, secondary position I had occupied for 6 years. Watching Reginald bask in an evening of significant professional triumph, while I quietly disappeared into the background of a story that had never once made room for who I actually was. For the last Saturday in September, held at the Grand Ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, the same venue, coincidentally, where diplomatic receptions I had once helped organize during my previous career had occasionally been held, though I did not mention this connection to anyone in the Marsh family in the weeks leading up to the event. I want to describe, honestly, the particular exhaustion I felt in those preparatory weeks, watching Reginald orchestrate every detail of an evening meant to celebrate his arrival at a level of civic and diplomatic importance I had, in fact, already occupied for years before I ever met his son, all while he continued to introduce me, in passing conversation with his business associates, as my son's wife, who has adapted wonderfully to all of this despite coming from a very different background. I arrived at the gala on the evening in question wearing a simple, elegant gown I had purchased specifically for the event, understated by the standards of the wealthy crowd expected to attend, but chosen deliberately, I will admit, with a kind of quiet, private confidence that had nothing to do with impressing anyone in that ballroom. Callum arrived beside me, handsome and visibly nervous in the way he always became at his father's most important events, anxious to ensure everything proceeded exactly according to Reginald's exacting expectations. The ballroom itself had been transformed into precisely the kind of gleaming, carefully orchestrated spectacle Reginald favored for events meant to demonstrate his own importance. Crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, a small orchestra playing softly near the entrance, waitstaff in formal black tie circulating with trays of champagne. I moved through the early portion of the evening largely unnoticed, greeting Marsh family friends and business associates with the same practiced, gracious warmth I had cultivated over 6 years of these events, entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not already know exactly how much diplomatic protocol expertise stood quietly among them unacknowledged. I noticed the arrival of the foreign delegation roughly 40 minutes into the reception, a group of perhaps a dozen diplomats and government officials moving through the ballroom with the particular composed formality of people accustomed to significant public occasions. I recognized several faces among them from my previous career, individuals I had once briefed or coordinated with during official visits years earlier, though none of them had yet noticed me across the crowded room, and I made no effort to draw their attention, uncertain in that moment whether I even wanted to reveal that particular connection in front of the Marsh family at all. It was roughly an hour into the reception, during the transition into formal dinner service, that I first noticed Ambassador Julienne Castellane moving through the crowd near the delegation, engaged in quiet conversation with several of the visiting officials. My breath caught slightly at the sight of her, a woman I had once worked alongside for nearly 4 years, whose mentorship had shaped much of my early diplomatic career before I eventually moved into the more senior protocol advisory role I held at the time of my resignation. I had not seen her since I left that career, and seeing her now, unexpectedly, in the middle of my father-in-law's gala, produced a strange, complicated wave of emotion I had not anticipated needing to manage that evening. I did not approach her immediately. I want to be honest that some part of me, even in that moment, still carried 6 years of careful conditioning that told me my former life belonged in a separate, private box, not to be opened casually at a Marsh family event where the accepted narrative about who I was had calcified so thoroughly that revealing the truth now felt almost transgressive. As though I would be violating some unspoken family rule simply by acknowledging that a woman across the room recognized me as something more than a former cleaner who had married well. Dinner service began shortly afterward, and I found my assigned seat at a table roughly midway through the ballroom, several tables removed from the head table where Reginald, Vivian, Callum, and the most senior members of the visiting delegation would be seated. This arrangement did not surprise me, given 6 years of similar seating decisions at Marsh family events, decisions that consistently placed me at a comfortable but clearly secondary distance from whatever center of importance Reginald had organized that particular evening around. The formal program began following dinner service, when Reginald rose to deliver what would become, over the following 20 minutes, one of the most elaborate self-congratulatory speeches I had witnessed in 6 years of attending his events. He thanked the visiting delegation extensively, praised his own strategic vision in securing the contract, described in detail the years of careful relationship building that had supposedly culminated in this evening's celebration, and gradually worked his way toward what I recognized, from years of experience, as his traditional closing sequence, a section where he typically offered brief, performative acknowledgement of his family before returning to further praise of his own accomplishments. And of course, Reginald said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system, "We must raise a glass tonight not just to this extraordinary partnership, but to everyone who has been part of the journey that brought us here. My son Callum, of course, has been invaluable in the operational side of this partnership." He paused, and I felt, before he even continued speaking, the familiar dread of knowing exactly what particular cut was coming next. "And I suppose we should raise a glass to Callum's wife as well, though I think we'll skip pouring her champagne. Given her background, I doubt she's had much occasion to develop a taste for it. She's just a cleaner, after all. Don't waste good champagne on someone who probably prefers something simpler." The comment landed with the particular careless cruelty of a man who genuinely believed he was making a harmless joke rather than delivering a public humiliation, and several nearby tables, unfamiliar with the family and simply following the crowd's polite laughter, chuckled softly at what they assumed was affectionate family teasing. I sat perfectly still at my table, feeling the particular hot, exposing shame of public humiliation delivered in front of 300 strangers, most of whom had no context for the comment beyond the assumption that it must be true, since a man as prominent as Reginald Marsh would surely not humiliate his own daughter-in-law with a fabrication. I looked toward the head table at Callum, hoping, as I had hoped at countless smaller moments over 6 years, that this particular cut, delivered so publicly and so cruelly, would finally be the moment my husband found the courage to correct his father in front of an audience large enough that the correction would actually matter. Callum's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, but he said nothing, simply staring down at the table in front of him with the particular helpless discomfort of a man who understood the comment was cruel but had spent 6 years training himself not to confront his father publicly regardless of the cost. It was at that exact moment, while I sat absorbing yet another public humiliation from a man who had spent 6 years constructing an entirely fictional narrative about who I was, that I noticed Ambassador Julienne Castellane rising from her seat near the head table, her expression sharpening with the particular recognition of someone who has just heard a familiar name attached to an entirely unfamiliar and clearly inaccurate description. She crossed the ballroom directly, moving with the composed, unhurried authority I remembered from years of watching her navigate far more consequential diplomatic tensions than a single cruel comment at a private gala, and she arrived at my table within moments, extending both hands toward me with genuine warmth that immediately drew the attention of everyone seated nearby. "Adelina," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough that several surrounding tables turned to watch, "I had no idea you would be here tonight. It has been far too long. Please, come sit with me. I want to hear everything about what you've been doing since you left the ministry, and I want to introduce you properly to the delegation. Several of them remember working with you directly on the Coastal Trade Summit." I want to describe, honestly, the particular vertigo of that moment. Watching 300 faces slowly turn toward our table, watching Reginald's expression shift from his earlier smug satisfaction into visible, confused alarm as he registered a woman he clearly recognized as a senior ambassador addressing me by name, with obvious familiarity. Moments after he had publicly described me as a cleaner unworthy of champagne, I rose from my seat and walked with the ambassador toward the head table, toward the very center of the room Reginald had spent the entire evening carefully organizing around his own importance, and I felt, for the first time in 6 years, something shift permanently in the particular story this family had spent so long telling about who I was. The ambassador guided me to a seat directly beside her own, displacing, I noticed with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and discomfort, one of the more junior members of the visiting delegation, who quickly and gracefully relocated without complaint once Ambassador Castellane made clear that my presence at that particular seat mattered to her personally. Reginald stood frozen near the podium, his earlier confident posture entirely dissolved, watching a scene unfold that he clearly did not yet understand but recognized, with the particular instinct of a man accustomed to reading rooms for his own advantage, as something that had fundamentally undermined whatever performance he had intended for the evening. "I must ask," Ambassador Castellane said, once we were both seated, her voice still carrying easily enough through the quieted ballroom that I understood she intended this conversation to be witnessed rather than private. "What exactly did I just hear your father-in-law say about you?" "Something about you being a cleaner." I considered, for a brief moment, softening the answer, protecting Callum and his family from the full weight of what I was about to reveal in front of 300 witnesses. But 6 years of careful cuts had exhausted whatever instinct I once had toward protecting people who had never once extended me the same courtesy, and I answered honestly. "That has been the accepted story in this family for 6 years, Ambassador. My mother worked as a cleaner, and my father-in-law learned that fact early in my relationship with his son, and simply assumed it must describe my own career as well. I never corrected the assumption as forcefully as I perhaps should have, and it calcified over time into something the entire family now treats as an established fact." The ambassador's expression, already sharp with recognition, hardened further into something considerably less diplomatic than the polished composure she typically presented in public settings. "Adelina worked as my personal protocol advisor for nearly 4 years, she said, her voice now carrying deliberately across the surrounding tables, loud enough that Reginald, still standing frozen near the podium, could not possibly avoid hearing every word. Before that, she spent 5 years in the diplomatic service as a cultural liaison and junior attaché. She personally coordinated the protocol standards for 3 separate state visits, including, if I recall correctly, the Coastal Trade Summit that several members of tonight's delegation participated in directly. She is, without question, one of the most capable protocol professionals I have ever worked alongside in my entire career, and I would be very curious to understand exactly how someone with that background came to be described this evening as a cleaner unworthy of champagne. The silence that followed stretched across the ballroom with the particular electric weight of 300 people simultaneously recalibrating everything they had just watched unfold, several guests near the head table exchanging startled, Uncomfortable glances as they registered the full scope of what Reginald had apparently gotten catastrophically wrong in front of the very delegation whose $400 million contract he had spent the entire evening celebrating. Reginald finally found his voice, though it emerged considerably less confident than the tone he had used moments earlier. Ambassador Castellane, I apologize for any confusion. I was simply, that is, my daughter-in-law's family, her mother worked in. I believe there was some misunderstanding about her own background specifically. There does not appear to have been any misunderstanding on Adelina's part, the ambassador interrupted, her tone precise and unforgiving. She answered your questions about her career history honestly, from what I understand. It sounds very much like the misunderstanding belonged entirely to you, Mr. Marsh, and I confess I find it troubling that a man hosting a diplomatic celebration of this scale would choose to publicly humiliate a family member with such obvious inaccuracy rather than simply asking her directly what her professional background actually involved. I want to pause the narrative here to describe what I was feeling in that particular moment, because I think it matters more than the satisfying spectacle of watching Reginald's confidence collapse in real time. I did not feel triumphant exactly, though there was certainly some measure of vindication in finally watching 6 years of careful condescension crumble in front of the exact audience Reginald had most wanted to impress. I felt, more than anything, a profound and complicated grief, the particular grief of finally understanding, with undeniable clarity, exactly how completely this family had constructed an entire relationship with me around a story they had never once bothered to verify, a grief made sharper by the knowledge that it had taken a chance encounter with a former colleague, rather than any deliberate correction on my own part, to finally force the truth into a room large enough that it could no longer be dismissed. Several members of the visiting delegation, I noticed, had begun conversing quietly among themselves, and one senior official, an older man I recognized immediately as Minister Adebayo Okonkwo, whom I had personally briefed on regional cultural protocols during the Coastal Trade Summit years earlier, rose from his seat and approached our table directly. Adelina Marsh, he said, extending his hand warmly, or should I say Adelina, I do not believe I ever learned your married name during our previous work together. I remember your briefing on regional customs before the summit vividly. It prevented what could have been a genuinely serious diplomatic misstep during our delegation's visit. I had wondered over the years, what became of you after you left the ministry? It is a remarkable coincidence to find you here this evening. I shook his hand, feeling the strange, disorienting pleasure of being recognized, in front of the very family that had spent 6 years reducing me to a single inaccurate detail, by someone whose respect I had earned through genuine, demanding professional work years earlier. Thank you, Minister. I left the diplomatic service to focus on my marriage, but I think of that work often, and I'm glad the briefing proved useful. Useful is an understatement, he said, smiling. I have told that story to younger colleagues many times since, as an example of exactly the kind of preparation that prevents embarrassing incidents at the highest levels. I am curious, given your evident expertise, whether you have considered returning to consulting work in this field. The ministry maintains ongoing relationships with several private firms specifically for this kind of protocol advisory work, and I would be happy to make an introduction if you are interested. I want to be honest that I had not, in that particular moment, considered returning to my former career in any serious way. Having spent 6 years building a quieter private life that I had, on the whole, found genuinely fulfilling despite the persistent undercurrent of the Marsh family's condescension. But something about Minister Okonkwo's offer, extended so casually and so genuinely in the middle of the very evening where my own family had just publicly humiliated me over a fabricated version of that career, struck me with a particular, undeniable clarity. Perhaps it was time to reconsider exactly how much of myself I had quietly set aside in service of a marriage and a family that had never once bothered to properly understand who I actually was. I would be very interested in that introduction, Minister, I said. Thank you. The remainder of the gala unfolded in a kind of surreal slow-motion aftermath. Guests near the head table continuing their conversations in hushed, urgent tones, several business associates of Reginald's approaching him with visibly concerned expressions, aware, even without fully understanding the specifics, that something significant had shifted in the room's perception of the man hosting the evening's celebration. Vivian Marsh approached me near the edge of the ballroom during that same surreal, slow-motion aftermath, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of embarrassment and something that looked almost like genuine reassessment. "Adelina," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology I don't think I've ever properly considered before tonight. I've introduced you to people for 6 years as someone who adapted well to our world despite a humble background, and I realize now I never once asked you what your actual background involved before deciding that was the correct way to describe you. I think I found it easier to believe the version Reginald had settled on rather than doing the work of actually getting to know you myself." "I appreciate you saying that, Vivian," I said, and I meant it, because Vivian's condescension, while consistent, had always carried a gentler, less performatively cruel edge than Reginald's, and I believed, in that moment, that her reflection was genuine rather than simply another layer of social performance. "I think what happened tonight makes something clear that I've felt for a long time without having the right context to name it properly. Nobody in this family ever actually asked me a real question about who I was before deciding they already knew the answer. Priscilla, Callum's younger sister, found me somewhat later in the evening, her characteristic performative kindness entirely absent, replaced by something more genuinely uncertain. "I gave you my old clothes," she said, almost to herself, as though working through the realization out loud. "I suggested you might want a job answering phones at the office. I did all of that because I genuinely believed I was being generous towards someone who needed the help, and I never once considered that I might have been condescending to someone who had built an entire career I couldn't have imagined." "You were being condescending, Priscilla," I said, "though I don't think you did it with the same careless cruelty your father sometimes did. I think you genuinely believed you were being kind, which in some ways is its own particular problem, because it means the condescension felt, to you, like generosity rather than diminishment. I'd ask you to think about that distinction going forward, not just with me, but with anyone else in your life whose background you might be tempted to make assumptions about. I do not want to suggest that these conversations, occurring in the immediate emotional aftermath of a genuinely humiliating public moment for the entire family, produced instant or complete transformation in how Vivian or Priscilla related to me going forward. But I will say that both relationships shifted meaningfully in the months that followed, Vivian beginning to ask genuine, curious questions about my consulting work rather than simply repeating her old, comfortable framing, and Priscilla, somewhat more slowly, beginning to treat me as an equal rather than as a project of generous inclusion. Callum found me near the edge of the ballroom roughly an hour later, his expression somewhere between shame and desperate apology. "Adelina, I should have said something years ago," he said quietly. "I should have corrected him the first time he ever said something like that, and I've spent 6 years telling myself it wasn't worth the fight, that it didn't matter what my father believed as long as I knew the truth. I understand now how badly that failed you. Watching that happen tonight in front of everyone." "You're right that it failed me, Callum," I said. "But I think we both need to understand something honestly tonight. This didn't happen because your father made one mistake 6 years ago and nobody happened to correct it. This happened because your family decided collectively that a certain story about me was comfortable and convenient, and then spent 6 years reinforcing that story every time it came up, and you specifically chose comfort over honesty every single time you had the opportunity to correct it. I don't think that's a small thing. I think it's the exact same failure your father made, just quieter and more passive." Callum did not have an immediate response to that, and I did not expect him to. We drove home largely in silence that night, both of us processing, in our own separate ways, exactly how completely the evening had reshaped the foundation our marriage had been quietly standing on for 6 years. The weeks following the gala unfolded with considerably more complexity than a simple, satisfying vindication story might suggest. The weeks following the gala unfolded with considerably more complexity than a simple, satisfying vindication story might suggest. Minister Okonkwo's introduction led, within a month, to a formal consulting arrangement with a private diplomatic advisory firm called Harrogate Global Affairs, a mid-sized consultancy that worked primarily with corporations expanding into international markets requiring careful navigation of cultural and diplomatic protocol. I remember my first meeting with the firm's managing partner, a sharp, efficient woman named Fabienne Rousseau, who had reviewed my professional history with evident interest before I had even finished explaining my 6-year absence from the field. "I want to understand something," Fabienne said, during that first meeting. "You spent 9 years building this expertise, reaching the level of personal advisor to one of the most respected ambassadors in the region, and then you simply stepped away from all of it for 6 years. What made you decide to step back in now? I considered how honestly to answer that question and ultimately decided that honesty, however uncomfortable, was the only foundation worth building a new professional chapter on. I stepped away originally because I wanted to build a quieter family life, I said. But if I'm being fully honest, I think I also stepped away because I married into a family that never quite understood or valued what that career actually represented, and over time, it became easier to let that part of myself recede than to keep insisting on its importance to people who consistently treated it as incidental. What changed recently is that I finally stopped being willing to let that continue. Fabienne nodded slowly, and I remember her response clearly because it struck me as exactly the kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement I had been missing for 6 years. That's an honest answer, and I appreciate it. I'll tell you directly that this firm needs exactly the kind of expertise you're describing, and I don't particularly care what assumptions anyone else has made about your background. What I care about is whether you can still do the work at the level your history suggests you're capable of. I'd like to find out. I began within that first month, working part-time on a project advising a mid-sized manufacturing firm expanding into 3 new international markets, work that required exactly the kind of granular cultural and protocol expertise I had spent 9 years developing before my marriage. I remember the particular satisfaction of my first substantive contribution to that project, identifying a potential gift-giving misstep during an upcoming delegation visit that could have created genuine offense had it gone unnoticed, precisely the kind of small, unglamorous, high-stakes detail that had defined the best years of my earlier career. Within 6 months, my part-time arrangement with Harrogate Global Affairs expanded into a more substantial senior advisory role, and within a year, I had built a modest but genuinely fulfilling practice advising 3 separate firms on diplomatic protocol for their international operations. I want to be honest that this return to professional work required careful, ongoing negotiation within my marriage, conversations with Callum about balancing my renewed career ambitions against our family responsibilities, conversations that, unlike so many of our earlier conflict-avoidant patterns, we approached with considerably more honesty and directness than we had managed during the 6 years preceding the gala. Ambassador Castellane, delighted to have reconnected, invited me to consult on several upcoming official visits, work that reminded me, with a particular bittersweet clarity, exactly how much of my own professional identity I had allowed to atrophy in service of a marriage that had never adequately valued it. I remember one particular conversation with her, roughly 4 months after the gala, when she asked me directly why I had allowed the Marsh family's mistaken assumption to persist for so long. I've asked myself that question many times since the gala, I told her. I think the honest answer is complicated. Part of it was love, wanting to build a peaceful life with a man I genuinely cared about, and worrying that constant correction would create friction I didn't want to introduce into a new marriage. Part of it was exhaustion, realizing early on that correcting Reginald rarely produced the outcome I hoped for. And part of it, I think, was a deeper uncertainty about whether the truth would even matter to people who had already decided what story they preferred to believe. That last part is the piece I find most troubling, Ambassador Castellane said. Not because your reasoning was unreasonable, but because it suggests something uncomfortable about how credibility functions for women in situations like yours. You needed my external validation, essentially, before your own testimony about your own life could be fully believed by people who claim to love you. That's not a small thing, Adelina, and I don't think you should carry the full weight of responsibility for not correcting this sooner. The family that consistently required external validation before believing your own account of your own life bears considerable responsibility for that dynamic as well. I found her observation genuinely useful in the months that followed, as I worked through my own complicated feelings about how much responsibility I bore for the 6 years of silence preceding the gala. I do not believe I was without agency in that situation, and I have tried, throughout this account, to be honest about the choices I made and the reasoning behind them. But I also found real value in Ambassador Castellane's reminder that the Marsh family's pattern of dismissal created the very conditions that made correction so difficult, a self-reinforcing cycle where each dismissed correction made the next correction feel even less likely to succeed. Reginald Marsh's reaction to the gala's aftermath proved considerably more complicated than simple embarrassment. In the days immediately following the event, he attempted, through Callum, to arrange a private meeting where he could, in his words, clear up the misunderstanding with me directly, a meeting I initially declined, uncertain whether I had the emotional capacity to sit across from a man who had spent 6 years constructing an entire fictional narrative about who I was, simply so he could offer whatever carefully managed apology his pride would allow him to construct. I eventually agreed to the meeting roughly 3 weeks later, held at a neutral restaurant rather than the family estate, and I want to describe honestly what that conversation revealed, because it was considerably less satisfying than a clean, decisive reckoning might suggest. Reginald arrived visibly uncomfortable, a man clearly unaccustomed to circumstances requiring genuine humility rather than the performative charm he typically deployed to smooth over social friction. "I want to apologize," he began, "for the comment at the gala. I should not have said what I said, particularly not in front of the delegation, and particularly not without understanding the actual facts of your background." "I appreciate the apology," I said, "though I want to be honest that I think the gala comment was simply the loudest, most public example of something you've done consistently for 6 years, Reginald. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern repeated at nearly every family gathering, and I think it's worth naming that clearly rather than treating this as an isolated incident that simply happened to occur in an unfortunate public setting." Reginald's expression tightened slightly, the particular discomfort of a man being asked to reckon with a pattern rather than a single, more easily contained mistake. "I suppose I did make certain assumptions about you early on," he said, "and perhaps those assumptions became more entrenched over time than they should have. I want you to know that regardless of your professional background, I've always cared about you as Callum's wife and part of this family." "I believe you cared about me in some genuine sense, Reginald," I said. "But I want to name something important. Caring about someone while consistently, publicly diminishing their actual identity and achievements is not the same as actually valuing who they are. You cared about a version of me that fit comfortably into a story you found easy to tell, humble background, adapted well to our world, grateful for the opportunity marrying into this family provided. That story let you feel generous and open-minded without ever requiring you to actually engage with who I really was, what I had actually built before I ever met your son. I think that's worth sitting with honestly, rather than simply apologizing for one embarrassing comment at a gala. I do not know, even now, whether that conversation produced any lasting change in Reginald's fundamental character, though I will say that in the 2 years since that gala, he has made visible, if imperfect, efforts to ask more genuine questions rather than simply constructing convenient narratives about the people in his life. He has, on several occasions, asked me directly about my consulting work, listened attentively to my answers rather than simply nodding politely and changing the subject, and I choose to believe, though I remain appropriately guarded, that this represents genuine growth rather than simply more sophisticated performance. My relationship with Callum required considerably more sustained work to repair than my relationship with Reginald, precisely because Callum's failure had been quieter and more persistent, a 6-year pattern of passive complicity rather than a single dramatic moment of public cruelty. We attended couples counseling for several months following the gala, difficult, uncomfortable sessions where Callum was forced to confront, in detail, exactly how much his conflict avoidance with his father had cost me personally over the years, and exactly how that avoidance had functioned, whether he intended it to or not, as its own quiet betrayal of our marriage. We worked with a therapist named Dr. Owusu who specialized in exactly this kind of long-accumulated resentment between couples, and I remember one session in particular, roughly 2 months into our counseling, when she asked Callum directly to describe a single specific instance where he had chosen not to correct his father, and to explain, as honestly as possible, what fear or discomfort had driven that choice in the moment. Callum described the dinner party incident with the trade official, the one where Reginald had dismissed my accurate diplomatic knowledge as trivia I had picked up from watching the news. "I remember thinking in that exact moment," he said, "that correcting my father in front of a business associate would embarrass him, and some part of me still, even after 6 years of marriage, prioritized not embarrassing my father over protecting my wife. I think that's the actual, uncomfortable truth of it. I had built my entire relationship with my father around never challenging him publicly, and I let that old pattern override what I actually knew was right in that moment." Dr. Owusu turned to me and asked how hearing that explanation, laid out so plainly, made me feel. "It confirms something I suspected for a long time but never heard him say so directly," I said. "That his loyalty to avoiding conflict with his father consistently outweighed his loyalty to defending me, even when defending me would have cost him relatively little." I think what's hardest about hearing it named this clearly is understanding that it wasn't really about me at all. It was about his own relationship with his father, and I was simply the person who absorbed the cost of that unresolved dynamic. I keep thinking about all the moments I could have corrected him, Callum told me, during one particularly difficult session, and I keep asking myself why I never did. I think, honestly, some part of me was afraid that if I pushed back too hard against my father's version of events, it would somehow validate that there was something to be ashamed of in the first place, like defending you too loudly would suggest I thought there was something that needed defending. But that reasoning doesn't actually hold up, does it? Silence isn't neutral. 6 years of silence taught my entire family that your humiliation was an acceptable price to pay for keeping the peace with my father. I appreciated that Callum eventually arrived at that understanding. Though I want to be honest that arriving at understanding, months after the actual damage had already been done repeatedly across 6 years, did not fully undo the particular exhaustion of having lived through it. Our marriage survived, and in many ways, has grown stronger since that gala, built now on a foundation of considerably more honesty than the one it previously rested upon. But I do not think it would be accurate to describe our recovery as simple or complete, and I want to resist the temptation to wrap this story in a bow that suggests 6 years of quiet damage can be fully repaired through a few months of counseling and a handful of difficult conversations. There was a particular session, roughly 4 months into our counseling, when Callum asked me a question that I still think about often. "Do you think you would have eventually left me?" he asked. "If the gala had never happened, if Ambassador Castellane had never walked into that ballroom? Do you think this pattern could have continued indefinitely?" I sat with that question for a long time before answering honestly. "I don't know," I said. I think I had reached a point, even before the gala, where the exhaustion was becoming harder to manage quietly. I don't know if I would have eventually insisted on a real reckoning on my own, or whether I would have simply continued absorbing it indefinitely, the way I had for 6 years already. I think that uncertainty is something I have to sit with, because I don't think it reflects particularly well on either of us, the possibility that this pattern might have continued forever without an external interruption forcing the issue. Dr. Owusu, listening to that exchange, offered an observation that has stayed with me since. "I think it's worth naming something important here," she said. "Adelina, the fact that you're uncertain whether you would have left on your own is not evidence of weakness on your part. It's evidence of exactly how effectively 6 years of consistent dismissal can erode a person's confidence in their own ability to insist on being treated fairly. That erosion is precisely what makes patterns like this one so difficult to interrupt from the inside. It very often takes an external shock, a chance encounter, an outside voice with enough authority to be believed, before the pattern breaks. Not because the person living inside it lacks courage, but because the pattern itself is specifically designed, whether consciously or not, to make internal correction feel impossibly costly. I found that observation genuinely useful in the months that followed, as I worked through my own complicated feelings about the 6 years of silence preceding the gala. I had spent considerable time in the immediate aftermath of the event, quietly blaming myself for not insisting on correction sooner, for allowing exhaustion and conflict avoidance to convince me that letting the story stand was simply easier for everyone involved. Dr. Owusu's framing helped me understand that self-blame more clearly, not as an accurate account of my own failings, but as one more symptom of the very dynamic that had made correction so difficult to begin with. I think often about the particular moment when Ambassador Castellane crossed that ballroom to greet me, and I have wondered, in the 2 years since, what would have happened to that evening, and perhaps to my marriage, had she not happened to attend that particular gala, had the coincidence of her presence not existed to finally force a reckoning that I had spent 6 years unable or unwilling to force on my own. I do not think that reflection is entirely comfortable, because it suggests that I might have continued absorbing that particular humiliation indefinitely without the fortunate intervention of an old colleague who happened to recognize my name across a crowded room. I have thought carefully in the time since about why I allowed that 6-year pattern to continue as long as it did, and I do not think the answer is simple or flattering. Part of it was genuine love for Callum, and a desire to build a stable, peaceful family life that I feared disrupting through repeated confrontation. Part of it was exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of understanding, through painful experience, that correcting Reginald's assumptions rarely produced the outcome I hoped for, and often simply cost me more energy than silently absorbing the comment and moving forward. And part of it, I think, was a quieter, more painful uncertainty about whether the Marsh family would actually value the truth even if I insisted on it forcefully, whether revealing my full professional history would genuinely change how they saw me, or whether it would simply be reframed, the way so many of my earlier corrections had been, as an understandable but faintly embarrassing exaggeration. The gala finally provided an answer to that uncertainty, though not in a way I could have engineered or predicted myself. The truth, once spoken by someone with unimpeachable external authority, in front of an audience too large and too consequential to dismiss, finally landed with a weight that 6 years of my own quiet corrections had never managed to achieve. I do not think that says something flattering about how credibility functions in families like the Marsh family, where a wife's own testimony about her own life apparently required external validation from an ambassador before it could be fully believed. But I think it is an honest and useful thing to name, because I suspect my experience is not unique, that many people, particularly women who marry into families with deeply entrenched assumptions about status and background, live through some version of this same slow erosion, waiting, consciously or not, for some external event to finally force a correction their own voice alone was never quite enough to achieve. If there is a lesson in this story, and I have thought carefully about what that lesson actually is rather than simply accepting the satisfying shape of the reveal itself, it is this. Silence, even silence chosen out of genuine love, and a desire for peace, allows other people's convenient assumptions about you to calcify into accepted fact, and the longer that silence continues, the more difficult and more dramatic the eventual correction becomes. I do not believe I owed the Marsh family constant, aggressive correction of every small comment across 6 years. But I do believe, looking back with the clarity that only comes after living through the consequences, that I could have insisted more forcefully, earlier, and more consistently on the basic dignity of being known accurately by the family I had married into, rather than allowing exhaustion and conflict avoidance to convince me that letting the story stand was simply easier for everyone involved. I want to go back briefly to the moment immediately following Minister Okonkwo's introduction to me at the gala, because there is a detail I have not yet described that I think matters for understanding the full weight of that evening. Roughly an hour after Ambassador Castellane first crossed the ballroom, the delegation's senior representative, a formal, measured woman named Director Isabel Nkemelu, approached our table with a question that, in retrospect, I understand carried enormous consequence for Reginald's $400 million contract. I want to ask directly, Director Nkemelu said, addressing not me but Reginald, who had by then approached the table himself in an attempt to salvage some portion of the evening's carefully planned narrative, whether the protocol failures we witnessed tonight reflect the broader operational standards we should expect from Marsh Properties as we move forward with this partnership. I ask because our government takes considerable care in selecting partners who demonstrate genuine respect and accurate understanding of the people they work alongside, and what I witnessed this evening raises questions about whether that respect extends consistently throughout your organization. Reginald, visibly shaken, attempted to reassure her that the evening's comment reflected a personal family misunderstanding rather than any broader operational concern, but Director Nkemelu's expression remained skeptical throughout his response, and I understood, watching that exchange, that the gala's aftermath would likely extend well beyond my own personal vindication into genuine consequences for the contract Reginald had spent 3 years working to secure. I later learned through Callum that the delegation's government did in fact request additional assurances before finalizing the contract, ultimately requiring Marsh Properties to implement a formal cultural sensitivity review process for its senior leadership, a requirement that Reginald, I am told, found genuinely humbling to accept. Though the contract itself ultimately proceeded to completion, roughly 2 months behind its original schedule. I did not orchestrate this consequence, and I want to be honest that I felt a complicated mixture of emotions upon learning about it, some quiet satisfaction that Reginald's carelessness had produced genuine professional consequences alongside the personal reckoning I had already witnessed, but also a measure of concern that the delay might have created broader complications for Callum's own position within his father's company, given that Callum had taken on increasing operational responsibility for the partnership over the preceding year. Callum, when I raised this concern with him directly, offered a response that surprised me with its clarity. "I don't think you should feel any guilt about that delay," he said. "My father created that consequence himself, the moment he chose to humiliate you in front of the very delegation whose trust the contract depended on. If anything, I think the delay taught my father something important that I hope actually sticks with him going forward, that the way he treats people, including his own family, has genuine professional consequences, not just personal ones. I think, honestly, it might be the first time in his career that carelessness like that actually cost him something tangible enough for him to feel it. I found Callum's response, delivered with a directness I had rarely heard from him in 6 years of marriage, to be one of the more meaningful signs that our relationship had genuinely shifted in the aftermath of the gala, a willingness, finally, to hold his father accountable rather than instinctively softening or excusing his behavior. I returned to my consulting work fully within the year following the gala, eventually taking on a position advising several regional firms on diplomatic protocol for their international operations, work that pays considerably less than what Reginald Marsh's real estate empire generates in a single quarter, but which returns to me something far more valuable than money, the particular quiet satisfaction of being known, finally and consistently, for exactly who I actually am rather than for a story someone else found convenient to tell about me. I want to describe one additional moment from the year following the gala, because I think it captures something important about the particular, quiet work of rebuilding an identity that has been diminished for a long time. Roughly 8 months after the gala, Harrogate Global Affairs assigned me to lead protocol coordination for a genuinely significant state visit, the largest single project I had managed since leaving the diplomatic service years earlier. I remember the particular anxiety I felt in the weeks leading up to that visit, a familiar, uncomfortable echo of 6 years spent doubting whether my own expertise actually mattered, whether I could still perform at the level my earlier career had once demanded. The visit proceeded without incident. Every detail I had coordinated, from seating arrangements to gift protocols to the precise sequence of formal introductions, executed exactly as planned, preventing several small potential missteps that could have created genuine diplomatic friction had they gone unnoticed. Fabienne Rousseau called me personally after the visit concluded, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "I want you to know," she said, "that the delegation specifically requested you again for their next visit. They mentioned specifically how thoroughly prepared and how genuinely knowledgeable you were, exactly the kind of feedback that tells me we made the right decision bringing you back into this field." I sat with that feedback for a long time after that call, feeling something settle in my chest that I had not fully realized I had been missing for 6 years, the particular grounded confidence of knowing, without needing anyone else's validation, that my own expertise was genuine and considerable, regardless of what story any particular family had once found convenient to tell about where I came from. I attended, roughly a year after the gala, a smaller diplomatic reception where Ambassador Castellane was again in attendance, and this time, Reginald Marsh, invited as my father-in-law rather than as the evening's host, watched quietly from across the room as 3 separate diplomats approached me throughout the evening, seeking my advice on matters of protocol and cultural sensitivity, treating me with exactly the kind of professional respect that 6 years of his own condescension had never once extended toward me. I do not know exactly what Reginald felt watching that particular scene unfold, but I noticed for the rest of that evening that he introduced me to his own business associates not as his son's wife who had adapted wonderfully despite a humble background, but simply, plainly, as Adelina Marsh, protocol advisor, a correction 6 years in the making that finally and perfectly arrived. I think, too, about my mother, who attended that same smaller reception at my invitation, and who watched, with quiet, dignified pride, as I moved through the room with a confidence that had taken 6 years and one unlikely coincidence to fully reclaim. She told me on the drive home that evening that she had always known exactly who I was, had never once doubted the value of the career I had built before meeting Callum, and had simply been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for the rest of the world to finally catch up to what she had understood about me all along. I want to mention, too, the reaction of the wider Marsh extended family in the months following the gala, because the story of that evening spread, as these things do, well beyond the immediate family into cousins, aunts, and longtime family friends who had, over 6 years, absorbed some version of the same inaccurate narrative about my background. Callum's aunt, a sharp, plain-spoken woman named Odile, who had always treated me with a kind of distant, polite indifference rather than active condescension, called me directly several weeks after the gala. "I want to apologize," she said, without much preamble, "for never once asking you a genuine question about your life before you married into this family. I think I simply absorbed whatever version of you Reginald offered at family gatherings, the same way most of us did, because it was easier than doing the work of getting to know you myself. I heard what happened at the gala, and I've been sitting with it since, thinking about how many other people in our family have done exactly the same thing, myself included. I appreciated Odil's honesty, and I want to note that hers was not the only such conversation I had in the months following the gala. Several cousins reached out with similar acknowledgments, some more genuine than others, and I found myself, in that period, developing a clearer sense of exactly which relationships within the extended Marsh family had been built on real curiosity about who I was, and which had simply been sustained by polite, comfortable distance that required no genuine engagement at all. I do not think every relationship within that extended family fully repaired itself in the aftermath of the gala, and I want to be honest that some family members, even now 2 years later, still seem faintly uncomfortable around me, as though my genuine professional history somehow disrupts a social order they had grown accustomed to and quietly preferred. I have made peace with the fact that not every relationship damaged by 6 years of careless assumption will fully heal, and I have chosen, instead, to invest my energy in the relationships, within and beyond the Marsh family, that have shown genuine willingness to know me as I actually am rather than as a comfortable story someone once found easier to believe. I did not choose the moment Ambassador Castellane crossed that ballroom, and I have thought often about how differently that evening might have unfolded without her fortunate presence. But I have chosen, in the 2 years since, to stop waiting for fortunate coincidences to correct the record on my behalf, insisting instead, consistently and without apology, on being known accurately by everyone in my life, family included, regardless of how comfortable or inconvenient that accuracy might prove for the people who once preferred a simpler, more convenient story. Some truths do not need external validation to be true. They simply need someone, eventually, willing to speak them plainly enough that they can no longer be quietly dismissed. I think, in the end, about what I would tell someone else living through a version of this same pattern, someone quietly absorbing an inaccurate story that a family they love has settled on out of comfort rather than genuine curiosity. I would tell them that the exhaustion is real, and that the calculation to let a small comment pass rather than fight it, over and over, rarely feels like surrender in any single moment. It feels, instead, like reasonable patience, like choosing your battles wisely, like understanding that some relationships simply require you to let certain things go in service of a larger peace. I understand that reasoning intimately, because I lived inside it for 6 years. But I would also tell them, with the clarity that only comes from finally standing on the other side of that pattern, that patience and silence are not the same thing, and that a story allowed to stand uncorrected for long enough eventually stops feeling like a misunderstanding and starts feeling, to everyone repeating it, like simple, settled fact. I would tell them that the cost of that silence compounds quietly year after year, in ways that are difficult to notice until the weight of it finally becomes undeniable, whether through your own eventual insistence or, as happened in my case, through some fortunate, unplanned collision between the story you have been living and the truth that has been waiting, patiently, the entire time, to be spoken plainly enough that it can no longer be ignored. I did not need the ambassador's validation to know who I actually was. I had always known that, quietly, privately, throughout every single one of those 6 years. What I needed, and what her presence in that ballroom finally provided, was a moment loud enough that the rest of the world, including the family I had married into, could no longer look away from a truth I had been carrying unspoken for far too long. I keep that folded seating card from the head table in a drawer in my home office now, not the one from the Marsh Gala, but a small protocol placement card from the very first state visit I coordinated after returning to consulting work, printed with my own name in the same simple, formal script that had once introduced me at diplomatic functions years before I ever met Callum. I look at it sometimes, on difficult days, as a quiet reminder of exactly how long a true thing can sit patiently in its rightful place, waiting for a family, or a room, or a single unexpected voice across a crowded ballroom, to finally notice it was there all along. She's just a cleaner. Don't waste champagne on her. I have turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count in the 2 years since Reginald first spoke it into a microphone in front of 300 guests, and I no longer feel the sharp, exposing shame it once produced in that moment. I feel, instead, a quiet, settled clarity about exactly what that sentence actually revealed, not the truth about who I was, but the truth about how easily a family can convince itself that a convenient story is worth more than the person standing quietly in front of them, simply because nobody had bothered, until an ambassador crossed a ballroom to ask a single honest question. I pour my own champagne now at every gala, every dinner, every quiet family gathering that follows, and I have made certain, in every room I enter since, that no one ever again decides on my behalf what I have or have not earned the right to hold in my own hand. It took 6 years of silence and one unlikely ambassador to teach me that lesson, but I have learned it completely, and I do not intend to ever set it down again.